December 16th, 1944. A biting cold gripped the Ardennes forest, a landscape of snow-laden firs and deep ravines that stretched across Belgium and Luxembourg. In the pre-dawn gloom, under the cover of a thick winter fog, a massive German offensive, spearheaded by panzer divisions, slammed into thinly stretched American lines. This was Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, forever known as the Battle of the Bulge. Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's commando extraordinary, famed for rescuing Mussolini, was nowhere near the front. Instead, leading a unit of English-speaking Germans disguised in American uniforms, his men were behind the lines, sowing chaos, changing road signs, and cutting communication wires. Meanwhile, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, commanding a Kampfgruppe of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, felt a grim satisfaction. His panzers had broken through, the spearhead of a desperate gambit to split the Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. The early hours were a blur of snow, muzzle flashes, and desperate American shouts. His men, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, pressed forward, believing in the Führer's promise of a decisive victory. They were the elite, the unwavering vanguard of the Reich, and they would carve a path to the Meuse. They had faced American artillery before, of course, the screaming rounds, the earth-shattering concussions. But this was different. The air above them began to crackle and explode, not with the familiar ground bursts of high-explosive shells, but with unseen detonations, raining down shrapnel from above. It was as if invisible giants were tearing the very sky apart. He watched as men, mere meters from impact, suddenly staggered and fell, their bodies riddled with hundreds of tiny, lethal fragments. A squad of grenadiers, huddled behind a knocked-out Sherman, vanished in a spray of red mist, untouched by a direct hit, yet utterly obliterated from what seemed like empty air. This was not the war they knew. This was something new, something terrifying. In the span of a single afternoon, Richter's Kampfgruppe, previously thought invincible, found itself bleeding men at an alarming, inexplicable rate. The American response was, in essence, an industrial behemoth awakening, flexing a manufacturing muscle the likes of which the world had never seen. The Germans, even at the height of their conquests, had only managed to produce around 47,000 tanks and assault guns throughout the entire war. The Americans, by 1944 alone, were churning out over 17,000 tanks annually, alongside millions of tons of steel, fuel, and ammunition. This wasn't just a difference in quantity. It was a fundamental disparity in the very concept of warfare. The American advantage wasn't simply their ability to replace losses. It was their capacity to innovate and implement those innovations on an unimaginable scale, to arm every man with the best possible chance of survival and success. The Germans, for their part, believed in superior training, tactical brilliance, and unwavering ideological conviction. They believed in the quality of their engineering, the fearsome power of a Tiger tank. But against the relentless, overwhelming output of American factories, even these pillars began to crumble. This was the moment where the brutal calculus of industrial might met the fervent ideology of the Third Reich, and the latter, no matter how fanatical, stood little chance against the former. The strange aerial explosions, the invisible killers, were just the beginning of that devastating lesson. The psychological impact on the German troops was immediate and profound. Imagine the seasoned veteran, accustomed to the mechanics of battle, suddenly facing an enemy that defies those mechanics. A shell explodes in the air, 10 or 20 meters above the ground, sometimes more, sometimes less, sending down a conical spray of lethal steel fragments. There's no crater to dive into, no obvious impact point to avoid. The danger is everywhere, coming from above, from what appears to be empty sky. It's not a direct hit that kills. It's the sheer indiscriminate coverage. A single American, 105mm artillery shell, equipped with this new fuse, could shower an area roughly the size of a football field with thousands of pre-fragmented steel balls, each traveling at immense velocity. Hauptmann Richter witnessed the demoralizing effect firsthand. Men who had stood firm against relentless Soviet assaults now cowered, looking skyward with a desperate, bewildered terror. Their officers, often as confused as their troops, struggled to explain what was happening. Rumors spread like wildfire. New American secret weapons, gas that exploded without a trace, supernatural intervention. The reality was far more mundane, yet infinitely more devastating for the Germans. American technological superiority, deployed en masse. This was the proximity fuse, a small unassuming device housed in the nose of an artillery shell. Developed by British and American scientists, it contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver. As the shell approached a target, be it an aircraft or critically the ground, the radar signal would bounce back, and at a preset distance, the fuse would detonate the shell. Initially, the proximity fuse was a closely guarded secret, deployed primarily in anti-aircraft roles, most famously against V-1 flying bombs in England. But by late 1944, with the Battle of the Bulge raging and Allied troops desperately needing an edge against the German counteroffensive, General George S. Patton, ever the pragmatist, convinced the High Command to authorize its use against ground troops. He understood the potential, the devastating psychological and physical blow it could deliver. The decision was made to deploy them by the tens of thousands. The scale of this deployment was staggering. By December 20th, just 4 days into the offensive, American batteries were firing an average of 45,000 proximity-fused shells per day into the German lines. This wasn't a precision weapon. It was an area denial weapon, a morale breaker, and a flesh shredder on an unprecedented scale. Richter, huddled in a freezing foxhole, listened to the ceaseless, terrifying crump, crump, crump above. He knew his men were dying, not in heroic last stands, but from invisible shrapnel, picked off like targets in a shooting gallery. The traditional German tactic of massed infantry assault, often relying on close-quarters combat and the cover of terrain, was suddenly rendered suicidal. There was no effective cover from an airburst. Forests, once a sanctuary, became death traps as shrapnel ricocheted off trees. The snow, offering camouflage from observation, offered no protection from the aerial rain of steel. The proximity fuse utterly negated the tactical advantage of concealment and cover that the Germans desperately needed in the dense Ardennes terrain. For every man Richter lost in direct combat, he seemed to lose 2 or 3 to the terrifying unseen explosions. This was a war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with science and industry, and in that arena the Germans were catastrophically outmatched. The contrast between German ingenuity in certain fields, their jets, their V-weapons, and their utter inability to match Allied industrial output or widespread technological deployment, was stark. They had their secret weapons, but the Allies had mass-produced secret weapons. The grim reality began to sink in for many German soldiers. They were not just fighting men, but an entire economic system designed for total war. On the other side of the rapidly shifting lines, Sergeant Michael O'Malley of the 101st Airborne Division, dug into a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne, felt a different kind of terror. German artillery had been relentless, but the new rounds from his own side, he called them tree-bursters, had changed the game. He watched through binoculars as German advances faltered, their men breaking formation, scattering in disarray. He'd seen entire platoons vanish under the relentless, invisible barrage. It was brutal, indiscriminate, and devastatingly effective. O'Malley, a farm boy from Iowa, understood the practical application of such a weapon. He'd seen the German numerical superiority at first hand. Without something to even the odds, Bastogne would surely fall. He overheard officers discussing the VT fuse, variable time fuse, the military designation for the proximity fuse. They spoke of its incredible complexity, its miniature vacuum tubes, its delicate calibration. It was a marvel of engineering, and it was saving their lives. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the Ardennes winter, that this technology had been a desperate secret, released now only because the stakes were so incredibly high. The decision to unleash the proximity fuse on ground targets was a calculated risk. The Germans had, for years, feared an Allied wonder weapon and had repeatedly tried to capture or replicate the technology. The worry among Allied command was that if a dud proximity fuse fell into German hands, it could be reverse-engineered, and the advantage would be lost. But in the desperate days of the Bulge, with the entire Western Front at stake, the risk was deemed acceptable. The gamble paid off. German reports from the front quickly began to filter back to the OKW, the German High Command. They spoke of new American artillery shells that explode in the air, unbearable shrapnel rain, and unexplained losses. General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most gifted panzer commanders, observed, "The American artillery was superb and caused us heavy losses." The new American shells, with their proximity fuses, burst in the treetops, turning our forest cover into death traps. Our losses were considerable. Another report from the 85th Corps grimly noted, "The enemy is employing a new type of artillery ammunition which bursts in the air before reaching the ground. The fragments are particularly dangerous and hard to protect against. Our losses from these rounds are noticeably higher." These were not the reports of a confident, advancing army. These were the panicked observations of men facing an unseen, unstoppable force. For Hitler, insulated in his bunker, these reports were dismissed as exaggerations, as signs of flagging morale, rather than a genuine technological threat. He continued to believe in the superiority of the German soldier, the power of their will, and the coming miracle weapons that would turn the tide. But for the men on the ground, the reality was inescapable. They were being decimated by a weapon they couldn't comprehend, couldn't counter, and couldn't escape. The grim efficiency of it was terrifying. Imagine being in a trench, theoretically safe from direct fire, only for the sky above to erupt, spraying down thousands of razor-sharp fragments. The psychological toll was immense. This wasn't just about killing. It was about breaking the will to fight. And it worked. The German offensive, initially so successful, began to bog down, not just from fuel shortages and stiffening American resistance, but from the relentless, demoralizing attrition inflicted by the proximity fuses. The battlefield, once defined by visible combatants and clear lines of fire, now became an invisible airborne killing zone. Richter watched a fresh recruit, no older than 17, his eyes wide with fear, try to dig a deeper hole in the frozen ground. It was futile. The explosions continued, seemingly indifferent to their efforts. He saw a man lose an arm, not to a direct hit, but to a fragment that tore through the meager protection of a fallen log. He heard the screams, not of men hit by bullets, but of men shredded by what felt like an invisible flak barrage. It was a macabre irony that a device initially designed to protect cities from aerial bombardment was now being used to obliterate soldiers on the ground. The very nature of warfare was shifting, subtly but irrevocably. This was total war, fought with total industry, and the human element, no matter how brave or fanatical, was becoming increasingly irrelevant against the cold, hard logic of mass production and technological advancement. In a desperate attempt to counter this new threat, German engineers and intelligence officers frantically tried to understand the proximity fuse. They studied captured American shell fragments, interviewed prisoners, and analyzed the patterns of detonation. They quickly realized the sophistication involved, the miniature radio, the power source, the safety mechanisms. It was a technological leap they simply could not replicate under wartime conditions, especially with their industrial infrastructure already crumbling under Allied bombing. The economic disparity was a gaping chasm. In 1944, the U.S. produced 300,000 aircraft, Germany a mere 40,000. U.S. steel production was nearly 80 million tons. Germany's struggling was just over 15 million. These weren't just numbers. They were the raw materials of war, the very sinews of battle. The proximity fuse was just one manifestation of this overwhelming industrial might. It was a symptom of a larger disease for the Germans. They were fighting an enemy that could invent, produce, and deploy cutting-edge technology faster and in greater quantities than anyone could have imagined. And for every wonder weapon Germany conceived, the Allies could counter with 1,000 mass-produced marvels. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately cost the Germans over 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. A significant, though unquantifiable portion of these losses were directly attributable to the proximity fuse. It was a blood price paid for underestimating the industrial power and technological ingenuity of the Western Allies. For Hauptmann Richter, the dream of a decisive victory in the Ardennes slowly, agonizingly turned into a nightmare of attrition. His men, once filled with the fervor of ideological conviction, were now just shells of their former selves, their morale shattered by the constant, inexplicable aerial explosions. He had seen the unwavering resolve of his soldiers on the Eastern Front, their willingness to fight to the last man against overwhelming odds. But this was different. This wasn't a fight against men. It was a fight against an industrial machine, against science itself, and against an enemy that seemed to control the very air above them. He remembered a quote from an old German strategist, something about war being an extension of politics by other means. Now it seemed war was an extension of industrial capacity by other means. And in that calculus, Germany was destined to lose. The relentless barrage of proximity-fused shells continued for weeks, even as the German offensive ground to a halt and began its slow, painful retreat. The bitter cold, the lack of supplies, the increasing aerial superiority of the Allies, all contributed to the German defeat. But the silent, invisible killer from the sky played a pivotal, devastating role. It shattered morale, negated tactical advantages, and inflicted casualties at a rate that was simply unsustainable. The proximity fuse didn't win the war on its own, but it profoundly shaped one of its most critical battles, turning the tide at a moment of extreme peril for the Allies. It was a stark demonstration that in modern warfare the factory floor could be as decisive as the battlefield, and a small, cleverly engineered device could inflict more terror and devastation than 1,000 charging panzers. It was a cruel lesson for the Wehrmacht, delivered from the skies above the Ardennes, a lesson in the brutal, overwhelming power of mass-produced technological superiority. The ideological fervor, the belief in will and racial destiny, could not stand against the sheer, devastating output of Allied industry. And in that frozen, blood-soaked landscape, the future of warfare was irrevocably forged, less by heroic charges and more by the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a tiny radar device detonating shells in the empty air. The true genius of the proximity fuse lay not just in its invention, but in the industrial infrastructure that allowed for its mass production. Each fuse contained a tiny, ruggedized radio set comprising 4 miniature vacuum tubes, a battery, and a self-destruct mechanism to prevent capture. These components had to withstand the immense G-forces of being fired from an artillery piece, forces equivalent to being accelerated from 0 to 3,000 miles per hour in less than a second. This was a challenge that required unprecedented precision in manufacturing and assembly. American industry, under the guidance of scientists and engineers, managed to perfect this process, churning out millions of these intricate devices. By the end of the war, over 22 million proximity fuses had been produced, a testament to the unparalleled manufacturing capability of the United States. Germany, by contrast, struggled to produce even rudimentary electronic components for its more advanced weaponry, constantly hampered by Allied bombing and resource shortages. While German engineers were brilliant, their industrial base was simply too small and too vulnerable to compete with the vast protected factories of North America. This disparity was a central, if often unacknowledged, theme of the war. It was a war of systems, not just of soldiers. For Richter's men shivering in their foxholes, the implication was visceral. They were not merely fighting American soldiers. They were fighting American factories, American science, American ingenuity, all coalescing into a rain of lethal shrapnel from an unseen enemy in the sky. The weight of this industrial might bore down on them, heavy and inescapable. The individual German soldier, brave and disciplined though he might be, was just one tiny cog in a crumbling war machine, facing an enemy that could effortlessly replace its losses and continuously upgrade its arsenal. The relentless aerial explosions chipped away not just at their bodies, but at their belief in a final victory. The psychological terror was a weapon as potent as the shrapnel itself. Men would refuse to leave cover, even when ordered, knowing that moving meant exposing themselves to the invisible hail. The once feared German tactical discipline began to fray under this unprecedented pressure. Orders were questioned, advances stalled, and the spirit of the offensive evaporated in the face of an enemy that seemed to control the very heavens. This wasn't a fair fight, not in the terms they understood. This was a battle between two fundamentally different approaches to war. One relying on elite forces, strategic brilliance, and ideological fervor, the other on overwhelming material superiority, scientific innovation, and relentless mass production. The latter, in the brutal crucible of the Ardennes, proved to be the more potent force. The legacy of the proximity fuse in the Battle of the Bulge extends beyond the battlefield. It signaled a profound shift in military technology, a preview of the electronic warfare that would define future conflicts. It underscored the critical role of scientific research and industrial capacity in modern warfare, demonstrating that victory often belonged to the side that could innovate faster and produce more. For the German soldiers who survived the Ardennes, the memory of the tree bursters and the invisible shrapnel rain would forever be etched into their minds. It was the moment they truly understood the insurmountable odds they faced, the stark reality that their will, no matter how strong, could not overcome the sheer unyielding might of the American industrial war machine. The illusion of German military invincibility, already cracking on the Eastern Front, finally shattered in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, under a canopy of exploding American shells. The war in the West, from that point on, became a brutal, grinding advance against a depleted, demoralized, and ultimately defeated enemy, all made possible, in no small part, by a tiny, complex device that exploded shells in the air. This technological marvel, once a closely guarded secret, became a devastating harbinger of the end for the Third Reich.